Hello everyone, to yet another video on the topic of data analytics core concept series. Today we shall discuss what history is all about and how is it being maintained. This is probably one of the most important and kind of a little bit complex topics as well in the data management and data warehousing or analytics field. So I will try to explain this to you as much as possible so that this is pretty understandable because we will use this information while we are testing this kind of a data set. Having said that, I would also like to mention that the history is maintained only for the master data, and in some extreme cases for the reference data as well. But it is never being maintained for the transactions type of data, because the transactions have to be complete from all manners in order to report a fact against them. So to repeat this, history is maintained only for master data and in some extreme cases for reference data as well, but never for the transactions, because the transactions have to be complete from all manners. Um, Now coming back to our topic for the day, how would history be maintained and how would the data will look like once there's a history maintained table, and what is the difference between the history maintained table and the usual tables or the usual data sets in the data warehouse. So how would you identify and how would you maintain the history for certain type of data? So number one, you will eventually need a date, which probably is a start of the record, which is actually the start of the event. So this is kind of an event which has a start date, and the start date will eventually determine when this event has actually occurred. We usually call them the start date because as I mentioned, it's the start of the event. So what you would tie this up to the type of the record it is. For instance, in this our example, in this case, the start of the record can be the account registration date. So taking the example of a customer registration, for instance, a customer actually comes to a website, he or she registers himself, and the data goes into the database in a certain table of the database. So the database will eventually take this information, the first name, the last name, the address, and all that stuff, and create a record against a certain user. So if we take the example of the of as I mentioned, to the customer registration date for a customer registration, once the customer puts their data into the table, this will have the start date. For instance, it's just an example. So taking the example hypothetically, the start date will eventually become the date when the customer actually registers themselves. So in our case, hypothetically, we will take the account registration date as the start date, and it has to come from the source. I will try to explain what a source and a target is in the upcoming videos as well. But for now, just consider it in a way that the source is your source of information. So you are trying to create a data warehouse, and the data the source of the data is somewhere else, or somewhere else outside the data warehouse realm. So it could be anything, a file or a table or a source system itself, or a big database like SQL Server, for instance, or Oracle or DB2, whatever. So it can be anything other than the data warehouse that we are actually creating. So we have to ingest this data into the data warehouse, and this start date has to accompany the record, to accompany every record. End date, end date we have to maintain by ourselves. Normally we also call it the end dates as the technical dates. So these technical dates will eventually be fabricated, and they have to be created by us by ourselves through our logic. How would these be maintained is, once, for instance, today a customer actually registers themselves and you receive a record from the database outside your data warehouse. and you ingest this into the data warehouse. So you have one instance of this record. Tomorrow you will receive this record with let's say with another registration date. It's not a good example, but let's say you get a record with another start date. Okay, so this has actually changed the start date, so which means that the start date will eventually has gotten updated. So what will be this case, that the start date will eventually become the end date will become the date in which this record inserted. So you have now two records. I'll show it to you through this example, so we can discuss this into detail. So let's say this is kind of the information that you're after. So you have, this is non-history maintained. So you see, uh, so you do not see any start date or end date associated with this kind of data set. But once you create, once you historize this, you will eventually be able to see more technical columns. So we used to call them, the start date actually comes from as I mentioned already, comes from the source, but the end date is a technical date which we have to fabricate by ourselves in order to maintain the history for this kind of record. So you see, as I've already highlighted the change, which I'm expected to explain to you. So you see, you have this kind of a formation of the data. So you have customer ID, and then you have the customer addresses. So customer ID is number one. Is customer ID has the house number one, street number X, street city X, and country Z. The second record has XXXS, which is of no use to our example at this point of time. So if I have to maintain the history for the record number one, how would I maintain this? I'll show it to you with a basic example. So see, if you can notice the impact of the change here. So you have number one, the same record, house number one, street number X, city X, and country Z, and then you have a start date. The start date is see, this is where the first instance of this record is. So you have the 9th of September, 9th of July, sorry, 9th of July 2022, and then you have this end date and 10th of July 2022, which means that you have received this record on 9th of July, and then on 10th of July you received another record, which is you did not receive this, but there is a change. See, the customer address has changed. So this customer address, because this customer actually moved from house number one to house number two. Taking this example of the same registration example, the customer actually maintained a record with us. What he or she did is that he registered himself when he was living in house number one, and then tomorrow he changed his address and he moved to house number two. Now what you have to do is, you will not override this record. You will maintain this history that he or she has been living in house number one before they move to house number two. So how would they actually do this? Is they create this record and with a set start date and an end date. Now the things to actually notice is, the house number two record has been created with an end date being null. So there are two multiple kinds of techniques. It depends on how the architecture is being built. The architecture, sometimes the developers make it in such a way, or the architects advise in such a way that we put the end date as null, or they can actually put the end date as a high date. So the high date is kind of the highest date available in the database. It could be 9999 12 31, which is like year 9999 December 31st, which is eventually the highest date available in the database. So sometimes they used to put this as the end date for the active records as null, or for the or highest date. So what does it mean by the active and the inactive records? So let's talk about this for a little while. So for the active records, what does this an active record mean? So the active record is the one which the customer has an active address. For instance, it represents an active address of the customer or an active demographic for anything for a particular event. For instance, if I go to a web shop and I get myself registered, as I mentioned to you already, taking the example further, this is my active record, and in the database it will be maintained with either the highest date or with a null end date. Because the end date is being maintained by ourselves, we are not receiving this from the source, so you should not expect to receive this date from the source at all. Because we have to technically maintain it, we have to develop a method in order to update and create the next instance of this record. Because if someone probably will look into this, they will think that uh, this is kind of violating the normal forms as well. But you see, these records are completely atomic. So they are atomic in the sense that the primary keys, when you talk about the primary keys, the primary start is always a part of the primary key. So once you change, so how would you do it? You will pick the customer ID and then you will start looking for the start date, and then you start tracking the change in the customer address. So you have two types of methods available in your data warehouse. So number one is the one which actually inserts the records. Number two are the ones which update the records. Okay. We used to call them upsert techniques. So upsert technique I will also discuss with you in the next sessions. But the thing is, we never delete a record from the warehouse. It is never recommended to delete any record or update or overwrite any record in the data warehouse. So what you do is you update that record in a way that you create a new instance, but the new instance will always have an end date as null date. So if you look at the record number one, you have this house number one, you have the start date already published, and then you have the end date already set. Now look at the record number two. The customer ID is the same. The house number has changed from 1 to 2, which is actually the change which we want to track. And then you have the start date exactly as the end date, which means that you do not have gaps in this date, because most of the times you have to agree with the customers that how much gap should we create. Normally it is 1 day, because the data warehouse life cycle goes from day to day. So they run these kind of routines at 12 o'clock in the night. So the thing is, every 12 o'clock means 1 day, so we maintain the state by 1 day. But the thing is, it has to be agreed with the customer, because in the retail industry it could probably be worthwhile to create the history on the day basis, because the frequency have to be agreed with the customer. So this frequency could either be 1 day, or it has to be an immediate, because in the telecommunications industry, once the customer changes their address, they go away somewhere else. This is a vital information, so they cannot afford a history based on 1 day, 1 day gap. So they ask us normally, which my experience is the same way. They ask the developers to start off the next record as soon as they receive a change. So for instance, if someone changed their address today, and the routine actually starts and the routine actually triggers itself at 12 o'clock, means that if today is 9th of July, then I will have to create the start date of the next record as 9th of July, but with an end date not being set, or being set to the highest date. I hope this is clear. But if there are questions, then please put them into comments, and I will most likely be able to explain them to you. Because the thing is, this is probably one of the most complex topics in the data warehousing. The history has to be maintained, and the thing is, it makes even more the stuff more complicated once we go into the reporting layers. Because if you have to report a fact on your reports, for instance, or on your monthly or your daily reports, or whatever purpose that you're actually creating the data warehouse for, if you have to report a certain fact, then you will never use the history records. You will always use the active records, because then history records are seldom used for reporting. I will say I have never seen any records, any requirements which are based on the history, because uh, the only thing that I've already seen is just one example where they wanted to do some predictions based on the records, on the history records. So they wanted to see how many times of a given fact has occurred. So they wanted to extract this kind of information in it, but it has just been only once in my career that I've actually seen this kind of requirement. So whatever being reported will eventually use the second instance of the object, which has the end date as either null, or how would you say, or being set to the highest date. So this is kind of a little bit complex from this perspective, given the fact that these kind of structures have to coexist into the same table. So we have to test them, but we have to disregard those tables, those records as well, which do not have a history maintained within themselves. So this is kind of something that is kind of a tricky situation, in which we have to also consider the records which are history maintained, and the other records which are not history maintained, because they coexist in the same table. So if you see the instances of the record one, they have two instances, but for the record two, there's no change. So they do exist in the same table. So I will try to explain this to you. How do we test them? But in order to test them, it is very, very important to understand what the history is and how the history is being maintained. So just to summarize this, what we've already discussed, history is when you create an instance for the given object, for an existing object, or an existing instance. So how would you maintain an instance? You have the primary key, the start date as a part of your primary key. So you track the change based on the start date plus the records, and then you see if there's been any change. So if there's been a change in the non-key elements, in the non-key columns, for instance, the customer address here in this example, so you will create another instance, but for the existing instance, you will populate the end date on the date you received the instance of this the new instance of this record. So for the previous record, you will close the state, you will close them. We used to call them the closed records. So we will disregard those closed records while we're reporting a certain fact. And what we will do is we will open another record, which we used to call them an active record or an open record normally, with the start date which we received the second instance. It could probably be today. We registered with the customer yesterday. We received this change today. So this today will become the start date of the next object, with the null date being set to the next object, representing that this is an active record. So the developers, once they have to pick the records for the purpose of reporting, will eventually be those records which do not have an active date, which do not have an end date, or the end date is set to to the highest date in the database. So they will disregard the rest of the records, and this has to be agreed with the customer, and this has to be based on the business requirements as well, which I will discuss with you in the next videos as well. So stay tuned. Do not forget to like and subscribe to this video, and if you have any questions, comments, anything which is complex to discuss, to understand, feel free to put them into the comments as a question, and I will most gladly have them answered. So thank you very much for listening up to this far, and have a great day and happy learning. Thank you so much again. Bye.